Tim, some people have suggested that, in talking about sort of this, for lack of better terms, post-Christian, de-churched, whatever, culture, that no longer can we appeal to, this is what the Bible says. And there's some of that even said that we need to quit teaching people that the foundation of their belief system is the Bible. But it ought to be the events behind the Bible, and that we ought to look at sermons not so much like working our way through books of the Bible because they accept the audience doesn't have the credibility for that, but instead we ought to be talking about the miracle and the wonder of who Jesus is, and kind of leading up to and using the Bible. I mean, how would you, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these discussions,
Yeah.
How would you?
Well, I'm wary of those kinds of discussions. I mean, I do know that if I'm talking to a non-Christian, what I would really want to do is I would want to start by saying you can trust the gospel narratives. And there's lots of scholarship that shows that what the Gospels tell us about Jesus is actually historically reliable. I would want to start with that. Otherwise, when I say Jesus said this, or this happened, or Jesus did this, I'm just pulling it out of the air. Mm-hmm. Unless I say, they're going to say to me, if I just say, well, let's not think about the Bible. Let's just tell you who Jesus is. Well, how do you know who Jesus is? Well, he did this, he said this. Where do you get that? So you have to start with at least the New Testament documents, the gospel narratives. Mm-hmm. Maybe you don't assume that the listener thinks that they're infallible and authoritative. Mm-hmm. You shouldn't assume that. But I think you actually have to start with them and say, here they are. If you've got questions about their reliability, let's talk about that. But otherwise, how can I talk to them about Jesus? Mm-hmm. They're going to think you're just creating a Jesus that you want. Mm-hmm. And which, by the way, that fits in with the modern idea that there's no sacred order and everybody has to actually define truth for him or herself. Mm. And so if you give people the impression that it's not rooted in history, what you're saying is not really rooted in something that actually happened, you're playing into that. So I'm kind of wary about that whole project. Though I do agree, you can't assume that listeners respect the Bible or think that it's authoritative. Mm. Absolutely, you can't start that way. So I'd say, I'm 10% there with what they're saying. But as soon as they say, well, we shouldn't be working through texts, we shouldn't be talking about texts. The early Christians were absolutely text-oriented. Hmm. They got together and they studied the letters of Paul, they studied Christian texts, they studied the Old Testament.
Even before the Bible was put together.
Yes, even before it was put together, they had the sacred writings. They just didn't have it under between two covers. And there's a new book by I'll mention this later on. Larry Hurtado has written a book called Destroyer of the Gods. It's about early Christianity. And he says the thing that was so striking to everybody was that Christians were so oriented around the book. It was a bookish religion, and they were studying the scriptures, and they were talking about the scriptures. And that was in a situation where none of their pagan neighbors believed the scriptures were authoritative, and yet they still talked about it. So I think it's short. I think the strategy you're talking about is somewhat short-sighted.